There is a photograph that should not exist, not because it was lost, not because it was destroyed, but because the moment it was taken, every person in that room understood, without a single word being spoken, that what stood in front of the camera would end the world as they knew it. The photograph measures 4 inches by 6 inches, black and white, slightly overexposed on the left edge, as if the flash struggled against something in the room it could not illuminate properly. 2 figures stand before a map of the solar system. One is human, a man in his mid-40s, broad-shouldered, wearing the pressed uniform of a senior Air Force intelligence officer. His name is Elias Crow. The other figure is not human. It stands nearly 7 feet tall. Its skull is elongated at the rear, its jaw narrow and almost vestigial, its eyes, and this is the detail that stops everyone who has ever seen the photograph. Its eyes are not alien in the way science fiction imagined them. They are not curious. They are not afraid. They are patient, utterly, devastatingly patient. The eyes of something that has been waiting for a very long time and has grown comfortable with waiting. What makes the photograph unbearable is not the creature. It is Elias Crow's arm, resting gently across the creature's shoulder, casual, familiar, like 2 colleagues pausing for a moment between meetings, both of them looking directly into the camera, both of them wearing the same expression. The photograph was taken on October 19, 1962, 3 days before the Cuban Missile Crisis reached its most terrifying apex. While the world held its breath over nuclear annihilation, something else entirely was happening in a room without windows, 90 feet below the surface of Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Dayton, Ohio. Nobody was supposed to know. For 59 years, nobody did. Then the photograph found Dr. Lena Voss. Or perhaps more accurately, the photograph chose her. Lena Voss was 43 years old when the envelope arrived at her faculty office at Georgetown University on a Tuesday morning in March of 2021. No return address, postmarked from a P.O. box in Albuquerque, New Mexico, that would later be traced to a man who had died 4 months earlier. Inside the envelope, a single photographic print, slightly faded at the edges, wrapped in acid-free archival tissue, and a note written in a hand that trembled with age or fear, or both. The note read, "Your father knew. He died because he remembered. You need to know what he forgot on purpose." Lena's father, Colonel Raymond Voss, had served in Air Force intelligence from 1963 to 1973. He took his own life on March 14, 1974, in the garage of the family home in Colorado Springs. Lena was 6 years old. She had spent her entire adult life building an academic career around military history, filling the silence of his absence with the language of classified documents and declassified archives. She told herself it was intellectual. She told herself it had nothing to do with him. She looked at the photograph for a long time. Then she closed her office door, sat down, and began to understand that her entire life had been a corridor leading to this single room. What she found when she started pulling the thread would not let her stop. The first thing Lena did was run the photograph through every authentication tool available to her department. Film stock, chemical composition of the developer, the specific degradation pattern of silver halide crystals in photographs of that era. She sent samples, microscopic fragments from the photograph's border, to a contact at the Smithsonian who owed her a professional favor. The results came back unambiguous. The photograph was genuine. It had been taken between 1960 and 1965 on military-issue Kodak type 2485 film, the same stock used exclusively by Air Force intelligence operations during that period. The photograph was real, which meant the thing standing next to Elias Crow was real. Lena began with the man. Elias Crow, born 1918 in Amarillo, Texas, graduated top of his class from West Point in 1940, decorated combat intelligence officer in the Pacific Theater, recruited into the newly formed Project Blue Book in 1953, rising to senior analyst by 1958. According to official records, Elias Crow died on February 9, 1968, of cardiac arrest at his residence in Arlington, Virginia, survived by his wife, Margaret, and one son, Daniel, age 11. Lena found his obituary. She found his military pension termination notice. She found the death certificate. Then she found him alive. A photograph from a 1979 Congressional Subcommittee hearing on intelligence oversight. Background, third row, partially obscured by a pillar. The jawline, the specific way the left ear curved, a distinctive asymmetry she had studied in every photograph of Crow she could find. It was him, older, but unmistakably him. A 1994 visitor log from the Nevada test site, obtained through a FOIA request so buried in bureaucratic cross-referencing, it had apparently never been examined by anyone. Signed in under a false name. Thomas Ellery, but with a security clearance code that when Lena traced it backward through declassified documents, linked directly to Elias Crow's 1966 personnel file. A blurry frame from a 2009 surveillance video outside a building in McLean, Virginia, that housed a private defense contractor. The figure was older still, walking with the careful deliberation of a man in his late 80s. But the profile, the posture, the particular angle of the head. Elias Crow had been dead for 41 years, and he was still showing up. Lena brought this to her department chair, a careful and cautious man named Gerald Harmon, who had spent 30 years navigating the politics of sensitive historical research. He looked at her evidence for a long time. He looked at the photograph. He asked her very quietly whether she had told anyone else what she had found. When she said no, he told her to keep it that way. He told her the photograph was almost certainly a very sophisticated forgery. He told her the longevity evidence was coincidence and pareidolia. He told her to drop it. He never looked her in the eye once while he was saying any of this. She dropped nothing. The next layer of the archive was harder to reach and infinitely more disturbing. Through a network of retired intelligence community researchers, people who spent their careers navigating the outer edges of what the government chose not to remember. Lena obtained a series of documents that had been partially declassified under an obscure 2017 executive order, and then apparently quietly reclassified within 6 months. Someone had made digital copies before the reclassification went into effect. Those copies lived on an encrypted server maintained by a former NSA analyst in Portland, who went by a handle Lena never learned to pronounce, and who communicated exclusively through a messaging application that automatically deleted conversations after 48 hours. What she found in those documents reordered everything. The official history of the UFO phenomenon in America begins, most people believe, at Roswell, New Mexico, in July of 1947. A weather balloon, the Air Force said, a radar reflector from a classified program called Project Mogul. The revised story went in 1994. Whatever it was, and the documents Lena was reading were very clear about what it was, the Roswell event was not the beginning. The beginning was 1944. Operation Paperclip is a matter of historical record. The United States government recruited over 1,600 German scientists, engineers, and technical specialists at the end of World War II. many of them former members of the Nazi Party or even the SS, and brought them to America to work on military and aerospace research programs. Werner von Braun, Kurt Debus, Arthur Rudolph. Men who had used slave labor in concentration camps were given new identities, new histories, and positions of enormous influence in American science. This is documented. This is publicly acknowledged. What is not publicly acknowledged? What the documents Lena was reading spelled out in the dry clinical language of bureaucratic intelligence assessment is what some of those scientists brought with them that was not human knowledge at all. A classified annex to the original paperclip intake files, apparently compiled by a small unit within the OSS that predated the CIA, described the recovery of what it called non-terrestrial biological and technical artifacts from a facility in the Harz Mountains of Germany. The facility had been operated by a division of the SS Ahnenerbe, the occult research arm of Himmler's organization, beginning in approximately 1942. The annex described the artifacts in the careful, almost deliberately boring language of people who were terrified of what they were writing, but had no other framework to use. One artifact was alive. It had been recovered by German forces in North Africa in 1941 from the site of what the original German documents called a mechanical failure of non-German origin. The SS had kept it, studied it, attempted to communicate with it, made, according to the annex, significant progress in establishing a mutually comprehensible symbolic vocabulary by the summer of 1943. The Americans brought it home in the winter of 1945. Lena sat with this for a long time. Outside her apartment window, Washington moved through its ordinary evening. Traffic, distant music, the ordinary noise of a city that did not know what she was reading. She thought about her father. She thought about the photograph. She thought about the map of the solar system on the wall behind Elias Crow, and the creature, and the words, possible origin point, written in red marker. She kept reading. The timeline that emerged from the documents was not the timeline that conspiracy theorists had spent decades arguing about in forums and books and podcasts. It was worse than that. It was more coherent than that. It had the terrible internal logic of something that had been carefully planned rather than improvised in panic. 1945. The entity. They called it Subject 1 throughout the documents, a designation of almost satirical understatement, is transported to Wright-Patterson. Initial communications are limited but functional. What becomes immediately clear to the small group of scientists and intelligence officers assigned to the project is that Subject 1 is not distressed. It is not trying to escape. It is, in the assessment written by the project's first director, a man whose name had been redacted in every document, behaving as though it expected to be here. 1947. The Roswell event. Not an accident, not a test, exactly. The documents described it as something closer to a demonstration. A craft of non-terrestrial manufacture, apparently operated remotely, brought down in controlled conditions over a sparsely populated area. Left there to be found. Left there with enough physical evidence to be unmistakable, but not so much as to be undeniable. The purpose, as the annex characterized it, was to establish the parameters of official knowledge, to show the American government what was possible without revealing the full scope of what was real. The craft was bait, and the American government took it. 1952. Communications with Subject 1 reach what the documents called operational clarity. For the first time, both parties can discuss complex ideas without misinterpretation. What Subject 1 communicates in these sessions filtered through a system of symbolic notation that had been developed over 7 years of painstaking work, is a proposal. Lena read the summary of the proposal 3 times because she could not initially process it as real. Subject 1 was not alone. It represented, it said, a much larger group, a civilization, or something that used that word in a way that did not quite map onto the human understanding of the term. This civilization had been observing Earth for a long time. It had specific interests in the human species that were biological in nature. It wanted access, structured, formalized, limited access. In return, it would provide technology. Not all of its technology, a carefully selected subset, things that would accelerate human development by decades in specific fields, without fundamentally altering the balance of power on Earth, or compromising the experiment, as it called the human project, in ways that would invalidate their interest in it. The word experiment appeared in the summary without elaboration. No one in the documents appeared to have asked what the experiment was. 1954. President Eisenhower, according to a document Lena read twice to confirm she understood what she was reading, met personally with representatives of this civilization at Edwards Air Force Base in California. The meeting lasted approximately 4 hours. He was accompanied by a group of advisors so small it could be counted on one hand. The document did not describe what was said or what was agreed. It only noted that following the meeting, a new classification level was created for all materials related to what was now being called Project Aquarius, a level above Top Secret that did not officially exist, and that would, the document said, be compartmentalized beyond the knowledge of any subsequent administration. The deal was made without any possibility of undoing it, and then Lena found the section about the exchange. She had been building toward it without knowing it. The documents had been pulling her in this direction the way a current pulls a swimmer who thinks they are moving freely until the moment they realize they cannot go back. The technology transfer had been real: fiber optics, integrated circuits, stealth aircraft technology, Kevlar, night vision. The documents cited specific patents, specific research programs, specific moments where human scientists working on classified government contracts had produced breakthroughs that could not be explained by the research trajectories leading up to them. Moments where knowledge had appeared rather than been discovered. The documents were careful not to overstate this. They acknowledged human ingenuity, acknowledged genuine parallel development. But the pattern was clear, and it was consistent, and it covered 40 years of American technological supremacy. The humans had given something in return: access. The documents used the word clinical, systematic, almost administrative. Access to biological subjects, the abduction phenomenon, the tens of thousands of reported encounters with small gray figures that began to flood Air Force records in the late 1950s and accelerated dramatically through the 1970s and 1980s, was not, the document said, unauthorized. It was not alien aggression. It was the fulfillment of a contract. The American government had agreed to look away. More than that. The document Lena found, dated from 1977, described an administrative structure, a reporting system. Cases that were flagged as contract adjacent were handled differently from cases that represented genuine misidentification or hoax. There was a process. There were forms. There was. Buried in a section of the document she had to read 4 times before she was certain she understood it correctly. A quota. Lena set the document down and walked to her bathroom and was sick. She stayed on the bathroom floor for a long time. She thought about children. She thought about the decades of testimony, the clinical examinations, the missing time, the scars, the psychological damage that lasted lifetimes. And she thought about the fact that somewhere in a filing system that did not officially exist, those experiences had been categorized, processed, approved. She went back to the documents. She had to understand all of it. The photograph from 1962 now read differently. Elias Crow was not just a senior analyst. He was, based on the documents, the project's primary human liaison, the creature in the photograph. And Lena now understood this was not a representative, but Subject One itself, still alive after decades, still present, still patient, was not being studied. It was being met with. Regularly. The photograph was, as the note in the envelope had said, a presentation. Crow was introducing Subject One as a partner. The formality of the moment, the deliberateness of the pose. The photograph was not evidence of a crime. It was documentation of a relationship. And then Lena found Daniel Crow, Elias Crow's son, 11 years old when his father supposedly died in 1968. Lena had noticed the name earlier and set it aside. Now she pulled on the thread. Daniel Crow had joined the FBI in 1981. By 1994, he was a mid-level agent in the counterintelligence division, unremarkable by most measures, the kind of career that generated no significant attention. But in 1994, he had filed an internal report. She found it in the same encrypted archive, apparently leaked by the same source, that described an investigation he had undertaken without authorization, an investigation of his own father. The report was 63 pages long and written in the flat, controlled style of a man who was very deliberately managing his own fear. Daniel had begun the investigation because of something he had found among his mother's belongings after her death. A series of notebooks, his father's notebooks, apparently hidden rather than filed, covering the years 1960 through 1968. The notebooks described the project, the meetings, the exchange, and they described something else. They described the nights when Elias Crow had been instructed to bring Daniel to the base. Daniel had no memory of these nights. He had always had a recurring dream that began in childhood and never entirely stopped. A bright room, very cold, a light he couldn't look at directly, a feeling of something watching him with interest. He had never connected it to anything. He had never had reason to. The notebooks said the project required periodic biological samples from the children of its participants, not as a punishment or a threat, but as part of the agreement's terms, the hybrid research program. The document used this phrase twice, both times without elaboration, required a continuity of access that extended across generations. The children of the initial participants were considered, in the language of the agreement, enrolled. Daniel Crow had been enrolled since birth. He filed his report in March of 1994. By April, he had been placed on indefinite administrative leave. By June, his FBI file showed a psychological fitness evaluation that described him as suffering from paranoid ideation, consistent with grief response and occupational stress. By August, the case was closed, and his security clearance was revoked. Lena could find no record of Daniel Crow after November of 1994. She was 3 months into her investigation now. She had not told anyone what she had found. She had not gone back to Gerald Harmon. She had moved everything she was working on to a laptop that had never been connected to a university network, that she communicated from only through public Wi-Fi sources she rotated systematically. She had started waking at 4 in the morning, certain she had heard something in the hallway outside her apartment, and lying in the dark for an hour before she could go back to sleep. She found the audio recordings on a Saturday in May. They had been digitized from reel-to-reel tape by the same Portland source, and they were degraded and fragmented, and in places nearly unintelligible. They were dated from sessions in 1965 and 1966, communication sessions with Subject 1, transcribed in real time by a stenographer whose typed notes accompanied the audio. The sessions were conducted through an intermediary process, a system of tonal patterns that Subject 1 produced and that had been assigned semantic values through years of careful mapping. A human interpreter would listen to the tonal patterns and speak their interpretation aloud, and the stenographer would type what was said. Most of the sessions were administrative, technical exchanges, status updates on the technology transfer programs, discussions of logistics. But one session, dated November 11th, 1966, was different. In that session, Subject 1 had initiated a topic that was not on the agenda. The interpreter's voice on the recording, male, careful, visibly unsettled, transcribed as follows. It is asking about the timeline. Not our timeline, the other one. I'm asking it to clarify. It's saying there is a point at which the exchange is complete. It's saying the current arrangement is a transitional arrangement. It's saying the word harvest. No, I want to be careful. The semantic value there maps onto something between harvest and conclusion. It's asking whether we understand that the arrangement has an end date, whether we have been told this. A long silence on the tape. The interpreter's voice again. Quieter now. It says we were told in 1954. It says the end date is adjustable. It says adjustable is the wrong word. It says the end date is dependent on what it calls completion. When the work is complete, I'm asking it to define complete. It won't define it. It says the people who agreed to the terms in 1954 understood what complete meant. It wants to know if we still understand. The tape cut out. There was no record of what was said after that. There was no follow-up session documented for 6 weeks. Lena sat in a coffee shop in Georgetown on a Saturday morning with the recording playing through earphones, and around her the ordinary world went on. Students with laptops, a couple arguing quietly over a menu, a barista calling out names. And she understood something that she had been resisting understanding for 3 months. The project had not ended. Not in 1968 when Elias Crow officially died. Not in the 1990s when the Cold War ended and the political architecture that had supported it changed shape. Not in 2021 when the Pentagon released its UAP reports with their careful, limited acknowledgments. The project had simply continued, underground, laterally, through institutions and contractors and networks that had no public face and no accountability to any oversight structure that still functioned. Subject 1 was still alive, still patient, still present. The children of the original participants and their children were still enrolled, and something had changed. Lena found this in the most recent documents in the archive. They were dated from 2019 and 2020, and they were different in tone from everything that had come before. The earlier documents, whatever their content, had been written by people who believed they were managing a situation they understood. These documents were written by people who were afraid. The communications from Subject 1 had shifted, not dramatically, not in a way that anyone who didn't know the history would necessarily notice. But the analysts who wrote the 2019 and 2020 assessments had spent careers in this material, and they noticed. The tonal patterns had changed their frequency distribution in ways that the semantic mapping system consistently translated as urgency, as acceleration, as the approach of something. One assessment, written by an analyst who had signed, only with initials that Lena could not identify, Said directly, the entity appears to believe that the terms of the original agreement have been met. It is communicating in ways consistent with a party who believes an obligation has been fulfilled and is now proceeding to the next phase of an agreement. The difficulty is that none of us have documentation of what the next phase is. We were not told. Based on the November 1966 recording and this analyst's reading of the current communications, it is this analyst's assessment that the people who agreed to the terms in 1954 were given information that was never passed down. We are operating without knowledge of what we agreed to. Lena closed her laptop. She walked home through the spring evening with the photograph in her bag and the weight of 60 years of hidden history in her chest. She thought about what the note in the envelope had said. Your father knew. He died because he remembered. You need to know what he forgot on purpose. Her father had been 29 years old when Eisenhower made the deal at Edwards. He had been assigned to Air Force Intelligence the year after. He had spent 10 years in a system that now, she understood, had been entirely structured around this agreement. He had resigned in 1973. He had killed himself in 1974. Lena had always been told, in the careful language that families build around unbearable things, that her father had suffered from depression, that the stress of his work had been too much, that it was a tragedy without explanation. Now she had the explanation. He had remembered. He had forgotten on purpose. She understood now what that meant. The deliberate suppression, the act of deciding not to know what you know. And then something had made him remember again, and he had not been able to live with it. She thought about what he had known, what he had agreed to, or watched others agree to, or simply witnessed and said nothing. She thought about the quota. She thought about the word enrolled. She thought about every person who had ever described waking in a bright, cold room, with something watching them and not being believed, and being told they were confused or dreaming or unstable. She thought about what Subject 1 had said in 1966, about completion. She arrived at her apartment building and stood on the steps for a moment before going in. The street was quiet. A light was on in the building across the way. Somewhere nearby, a radio was playing something she couldn't quite identify. Her phone buzzed. An email from an address she didn't recognize, a string of random characters that suggested an encrypted temporary account. The message was one sentence. The photograph you received is not from 1962. Lena stood very still. She took the photograph out of her bag and looked at it again. The same image she had studied for months. Elias Crow in his uniform. Subject 1 beside him, patient and enormous. The solar system map. The plaque on the wall, both of them looking directly into the camera. She looked at the plaque more carefully than she had before. She had read it 100 times. Project Blue Book. Roswell artifact and biological subject, but she had been looking at the content of the plaque, and not at the plaque itself. Not at its condition, not at its surface. In every photograph she had seen of Project Blue Book materials from the 1960s, the hardware, the plaques, the metal fixtures, all had the slightly dull surface of that era's manufacturing, a particular quality of light absorption. The plaque in the photograph was not dull. It had the surface quality of contemporary manufacturing, recent manufacturing. Lena opened the email again. A second message had arrived from the same address, sent 4 minutes after the first. You were sent the photograph because someone needed you to start looking. You found what you were supposed to find. The archive you've been reading was assembled for you. You were chosen for the same reason your father was chosen. The photograph was taken 6 weeks ago. The figure on the left is not Elias Crow. We don't know who it is. Subject 1 looks the same as it always has. It always looks the same. A third message arrived. Stop looking. They know you've seen it. Your father stopped looking and they let him live for another year. He looked again, and they didn't wait. We're sorry. We're sorry there was no other way to warn you. We're sorry we needed you to see it first before we could tell you to run." Lena stood on the steps of her apartment building in the quiet spring evening and understood that the investigation was over because it had never been an investigation. It had been an introduction. She looked down at the photograph one last time. The two figures, the map, the plaque with its too bright surface, the patient, enormous eyes of the creature in the frame. Both figures looking directly into the camera. Both of them looking, she now understood, directly at her. She ran. What happened to Dr. Lena Voss after March of 2021 is not fully known. Her faculty position at Georgetown University was officially terminated in September of that year for what the university cited as prolonged, unauthorized absence. Her apartment was vacated. Her car was found at Dulles International Airport in May, with no corresponding flight record under her name on any airline operating that day. The laptop she had used for her research was never recovered. The photograph was found in an evidence locker at a Washington Metropolitan Police precinct in 2023, submitted as part of an unrelated investigation into mail fraud, with no documentation of how it arrived or who submitted it. A detective named Ramon Castillo examined it briefly, noted that it appeared to be a standard vintage photograph, and placed it back in the locker. He told a colleague it gave him an odd feeling, and said nothing more about it. 3 months later, Detective Castillo filed a report describing a recurring dream. A bright room, very cold. Something watching him from across the room with an interest he could not describe as anything other than professional. He attached the report to an internal file and marked it as non-operational. The photograph remains in the evidence locker. The locker is numbered. The building is real. Somewhere in Washington, behind a door that requires a key card and a 4-digit code, it sits in a manila envelope with no name on the front, waiting, and Detective Castillo still cannot remember 3 hours of the night of March 4th, 2023. No one has ever been able to tell him who checked the photograph out of the locker for those 3 hours, because the sign-out log for that date shows only one entry in a column that should contain dozens. The entry reads, "Returned. Condition unchanged." The signature beneath it is not human handwriting, and no one in the precinct can explain why. When the surveillance camera footage from that corridor was reviewed, it showed nothing. Not an empty hallway, not static, not a technical failure, but a room full of ordinary people going about ordinary work, none of whom, when questioned, had any memory of being there that night. The camera, the technician noted in his report, appeared to have been recording something real, just not the same reality the rest of the building occupied. The photograph is still there, and somewhere in a room without windows, in a building that does not appear on any public map, something old and patient is looking at a photograph of its own. A photograph of Lena Voss, standing at the steps of her apartment building on a quiet spring evening, looking down at something in her hands. No one knows who took it,